The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Glad to have you all here tonight. I'd like to remind everybody that this is the call-in show, live call-in. Call in 343-9927, 343-9927 to offer your thoughts, questions, and rebuttals to anything that Lang and I might say on the topic of the evening. And good evening, Lang. Lang Baker's here with me as usual. Thank you, Lang.
Wayne.
Good to have you here. Good to see you, buddy. Okay, so tonight's topic, Lang, and as I'm sure you know, because you listened to the promo all week,
Oh, yeah.
the sunny side of natural catastrophes. And, of course, that was just a glib little joke I made, the sunny side of storms or whatever. But I got to thinking, I guess, about the hurricanes we've had recently and the earthquakes and whatnot. I thought, these are things that happen in nature. They happen naturally. So there's got to be natural benefits to these events. Hurricanes, floods, what else do I? Forest fires, things like that. There have to be natural benefits to them. So what makes them catastrophes or disasters?
Yeah, I would say getting in the way of them is the first thing that makes it a disaster. If there's no people around.
If there's no people around and they happen, we teach about them in schools and whatnot, and we say this is nature. But if people live in those areas and they occur, well, now it's a disaster, right?
Usually it is pretty disastrous when earthquake hits where you are,
or floods or anything else. Yeah. Well, you came up with more catastrophes than I did, or disasters. I came up with hurricanes, floods, forest fires, tornadoes, and earthquakes.
Yeah, and then there are also volcanic eruptions and blizzards, droughts, and heat waves, avalanches and sinkholes, and associated with earthquakes or tsunamis.
Well, let's talk first about hurricanes, since they're in the news today, actually, and for the past month or so. Did you find any upsides to hurricanes, or any natural benefits to hurricanes?
I can't say that I found any natural benefits, but I'm sure you can enlighten us with a few.
Yeah, actually, well, that was the whole reason why I wanted to do this topic tonight. But, I'm looking at an article here from Mother Jones magazine, and I also found the same thing in other sites regarding meteorology and whatnot. But hurricanes are actually very important. They call them tropical cyclones here, but they are very important naturally to the health of the globe, our Earth. Number one, to me, the thing that really impressed me was that they maintain the global heat balance. The tropics around the equator is a much larger area, and it's exposed to much more sunlight, much more of the sun's heat than the poles are. So it tends to become a lot hotter at the equator, whereas the poles, as we know, are much colder. And so what hurricanes actually do is they transfer heat when they pick up the water in the oceans and everything. That it transfers heat by moving away from the equator and bringing heat up to the North Poles, or the South Pole, I guess. And it keeps the heat balance in balance,
It cycles.
Yeah, it is a cycle, right? And but it's a constant thing where if it didn't happen, things would get out of balance, and you'd have ice ages, I guess, or whatever, or extreme heat around the equator in the tropical areas and all that. But it's essential to nature to keep that happy medium, which, of course, is what nature wants, is everything to be in balance, right?
Well, I don't know if it wants it. I think that's how nature works.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, right. You're right.
It moves towards a state of balance, and if hurricanes are part of that process,
and that's what I'm getting at.
That's
yeah.
how it happens.
Thanks for helping me out with my poor use of the English language here, but that is it, right? You know, nature is a balance of everything, and
it's a system that moves towards equilibrium.
Right. Just as water moves toward its own level, it's always going to move toward the lower area and its own level. It's going to find a level spot somewhere, and you can't have a body of water that's at different levels. It's just not possible. Is it?
Well, not within the same body of water, but with locks you can establish different levels in the canal.
But in the same body, yeah, all right. Okay, another thing that tropical cyclones do, according to this Mother Jones article and elsewhere, is it helps to drive the process of upwelling in the oceans, thus playing a part in the thermohaline circulation. Now, I've known for decades what thermohaline circulation is, but just for the benefit of those who...
Like me.
Yeah, right.
Benefit of people like me.
Yeah.
Tell me, Wayne, what is that?
Yeah, well, the thermohaline circulation is a part of the large-scale ocean circulation that is driven by global density gradients, by surface heat and freshwater fluxes. And to put it in layman's terms, I mean,
for me.
Yeah, well, you know, I had to look this up. You know that, but you're just playing along. But the density differences occur as a result of differences in temperatures, which changes the density of the liquid, the water, and also fresh water coming in is going to be a different density from seawater, and I think seawater is denser than fresh. You're nodding your head. You know that for a fact? Okay. So yeah, that's all those things contribute to what we know as the natural currents of the Earth's oceans. So hurricanes benefit or help that process. They also stir up the ocean, causing nutrients to be cycled up from the lower regions of the ocean up toward the surface, and that helps that there too. So again, it's that cycle thing, and you know, keeping everything moving and mixed up and whatnot is what makes nature continue, I suppose. You know, and just kind of the yin and yang type of thing. It's as long as it's in balance, it's healthy. Of course, there are things being done that are throwing things out of balance now, and I think we're seeing that. We're seeing nature's response to it with the warmer oceans, and so now we have more violent hurricanes because there's more heat that's going to be transferred or needs to be transferred away. And
yeah, I guess philosophically you could say we're shifting the balances through our contribution of CO2 and other heat-retaining gases into the atmosphere. So the balance is being shifted as to where that equilibrium point will be centered. And equilibrium isn't a static balance. It's like a dance. Like when you ride a bicycle, your bike doesn't stay perfectly vertical. It shifts back and forth and from side to side, and that maintains an equilibrium.
Right.
But it's not a steady state.
Yeah, and the way I learned it, I guess, is in like chemical equations or whatnot. You're on opposite sides of an equal sign or a reaction. You have the elements, and then you have the product. And if one of the things increases, then something on the other side has to increase also, you know, and it has to maintain a balance. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we're causing more heat, I guess, in the environment.
To be retained.
And so something else has to happen to release that heat and return it up to other areas. Okay, and let's see. The other thing was just rainmakers. Tropical cyclones are important rainmakers. It states here that they provide 25% or more of available rainfall in places like Japan, India, and Southeast Asia, as well as Texas. And I thought this was interesting. This article was from 2011, and they closed out that line with saying, not to mention Texas, which desperately needs a dousing ASAP. Well,
they got it dousing.
They got it, which produced a natural disaster.
Well, that's debatable.
What do you mean?
The hurricane was a natural event. The disaster part of it, a disaster in dictionaries generally is defined as a sudden event that causes great human suffering or damage to property. And so if there's nothing in the path of the hurricane that can be damaged or injured, then it's not a disaster, but the event is still a hurricane.
Right.
And so in Houston, what we saw was a disaster in the face of this natural event, but there were other factors than just the hurricane, just the natural event. There was also the alteration that has taken place in that part of the country through population growth and through the kind of infrastructure they put in that population growth. And so there's a human component in the sequence of events that resulted in the disaster when that hurricane.
Right. So really, when they say that it's an unprecedented human disaster, or unprecedented natural disaster, or whatever, it's not necessarily because the storm was more intense. It's because there were more people there. And, of course, the consequences were made worse by the fact, like you said, that the types of infrastructure they built, and I would suggest the amount of infrastructure built, a lot of
and
the
also
paving.
the amount of rain. So it was a convergence of these two factors or sets of factors: the natural event and the alteration in the terrain in the presence of human society, infrastructure, and people.
Right. Yeah, and it would have been a lot less severe of a disaster for people. Well, a lot less of a disaster if they hadn't had so much of the ground that had been filled in and paved and whatnot, to where there are fewer places for the water to run off, and so it built up elsewhere, which really is in a large part what caused the floods last year in Baton Rouge.
That's what I was just going to say. It was occurring to me too, recalling the assertions that a lot of the flooding over in Livingston Parish, in a certain part of the parish, was because the natural flow of the water was blocked by the way they constructed the interstate over there.
Yes,
so there's a human factor in producing that disaster.
But in general, it's overbuilding, everywhere. I mean, a lot of subdivisions have been built by putting in dirt into low-lying areas and then building on top of it, including
building
roads.
Without putting the dirt in, for that matter.
Yeah, then the houses flood.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different factors contributing to what made that a disaster.
And what blows me away, Lang, is there are two subdivisions proposed right now in Baton Rouge, very large ones. One between the River Road and the Levee, down off of Nicholson, I think, and one out by Jones Creek Road. And the one out by Jones Creek Road, the people have been screaming about at the Metro Council meetings and apparently making some headway to stop it. But from what I understand, there's a large low area surrounded by subdivisions, and all the runoff from those subdivisions runs into this low-lying area. Well, now some developer and the Metro Council are proposing to fill that in and build another subdivision. So naturally, the people around it are upset. But that's the phenomenon here. They're setting us up for yet another natural human disaster, or how should I say? I'm trying to come up with the right words for that, but it basically is a human disaster because humans make it worse.
Yeah, there's a human factor in the degree of disaster that results from the natural event.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to flog that one too much anyway. I do want to talk a little bit more about hurricanes, unless you want to take it off in a different direction. I want to remind everybody first, though, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about the benefits and other aspects of natural phenomena and natural disasters and the like. Feel free to call in 343-9927, 343-9927. Speaking of people being in the way of storms, we've known for a bazillion years, well, at least a couple hundred, that the Mississippi Gulf Coast, hurricanes hit there, floods hit there. And that's been going on since there have been records kept, and probably before that. But we know that, and yet even with the acknowledgement of rising sea levels, even though people still want to dispute the causes of the rising sea levels and the greater intensity of storms due to the warming of the oceans, I have a September 18th, September 18th of this month, the year, story from U.S. News and World Report that states here, fierce storms haven't slowed the growth along U.S. coastlines. And it says that the population of the counties in Texas that had flooded grew by 12% from 2010 to 2016. In general, along the eastern seaboard of the United States, it's gone up by 12%. It's and the reason the reason the author gives here, or the people he talked to in the article give, is it's people investing. There's investment properties and all that. People can make a lot of money building beachfront properties, and so they do, even though they know all this is going to could be damaged with the hurricanes.
Yeah, there are hurricane issues, and then there's rising sea level issues, which the hurricanes, depending, like in earthquake zones, if your building codes are strong enough and enforced and provide for construction of structures that can withstand the hurricanes or the earthquakes, then the disaster potential is reduced greatly. But if you got sea level rise coming, then you've got to take a different kind of approach if you're going to avoid a disaster from that.
Right. Well, we often talk about the magnitude of a disaster in terms of dollars in damage.
And lives lost.
And lives lost, yeah. But, okay, let's take the Mississippi Gulf Coast as an example, since I lived there. I lived there for a long time, or a while. Back before all the big casinos and everything, it was pretty much a sleepy little town. Had fishing piers, a lot of locally owned restaurants right there on the beach. And they were all nice, but they weren't really big, fancy structures and all that. So when it got wiped out by like Hurricane Camille, it was a significant loss, but the value of what was lost was not that high relatively, because the value of the property wasn't that great. But then the casinos come in and build these fancy, huge structures, multi-story buildings and whatnot, and Katrina came through and the storm surge wiped out all that stuff, and that was a very huge loss financially as well as human loss. So I guess, we need to live there. We need to live in these places, but maybe we shouldn't spend so much money on fancy structures, just to attract more people down there to get affected by all these natural events and thus resulting in natural catastrophes. But
well, I guess part of the question there is who's going to bear the risk for the financial loss when you're talking about that. Whether you're going to plan for an effective evacuation route for the people who don't invest or aren't the owners of these big fancy resorts, but who just live there or who are visiting there because they've been attracted by these resorts. And so you could mitigate the risk of a disaster in terms of lives lost if you've got an effective warning system and evacuation plan. And for the buildings, then it's a question of, well, are these investors assuming all that risk, or are they going to look for the rest of us to bail them out and to reconstruct?
And that was the case before Katrina on the Gulf Coast. But now, as I mentioned before the show, the companies that have come in and built back up with condominiums and whatnot, the lower 2 stories or so of all their buildings are parking garages or something that is that won't contain a whole lot of high-value property that will also allow a storm surge to flow through without damaging the building. There's hardly any surface area there to block the water.
So they've taken into account in their design a way to mitigate it becoming a disaster for them in financial terms.
And of course, they should have taken those precautions before, but there you go. That's the way humanity works, and I long ago quit getting upset about the way humanity works. It's pointless. But I'd be angry all the time. But let's go to another natural phenomenon.
Okay.
That becomes a catastrophe when people move there. Floods, and I mean by floods I mean river floods, rivers overflowing their banks. That's pretty much an ancient phenomenon, is it not? And very much, well, ever since we've had rivers,
Well, yeah, rivers were some of the places that humans first congregated to build.
And that was because of the benefits
and the benefits, yeah,
of flooding, really.
Well, in some cases, yeah, like the Nile civilization, the Egyptian civilization on the Nile, they relied on the annual floods to provide the fertility for their fields, and it was incorporated into the way they lived, just so it wasn't a disaster because they were living in harmony with that cycle of floods.
That's a big thing, living in harmony, learning to live with nature instead of trying to change it, which seems to be one of the reasons why we have natural human disasters now, too, right? Because we try to alter, or deny nature. But yeah, what I wanted to get at, and you're getting at, is the flooding distributes fresh nutrients across the flood plains, and also brings nutrients back into the river water when it recedes, and enriches the river water as well. It's a mutually beneficial phenomenon, as well as replenishing the groundwater, when it floods, and moving species of fish and other organisms around.
Yeah, when your floods are in an area that has beneficial nutrients, but when you've got floods in an area that's polluted with fertilizers, like we were talking about on the Gulf Dead Zone, then when you get a flood there, what it washes in isn't something that's beneficial and provides nutrients downstream. Well, it does provide nutrients in a sense, in that
just
the algae blooms are the result, but still it's not in harmony with the way that nature evolved.
Right. We threw it out of balance, and that ends up causing a further imbalance in the Gulf or the mouths of any river, as we saw around the world.
Right.
And that causes the big dead zones, reduction in oxygen, and mass death of our food sources and whatnot. Okay, well, let's see. Those are floods. Do you have any other particular catastrophes you'd like to bring up that have sunny sides or positive effects?
Well, it depends on what time scale you're looking at, but volcanoes on a certain long-term time scale provide some benefits in the minerals from deep in the earth that they bring up and the fertile plains they produce. But like I say, it's a long time frame before you've got fertile land that you can grow crops on around the volcanoes.
Well, yeah, but volcanoes occurred back around while the Earth was still forming. I mean, I realize they still occur now, but we're talking like 6,000 years ago, right? That's how old the Earth is. But oh, wait a minute, I said I wasn't going to go there. But anyhow, so there have already been a lot of fertile plains, fertile areas created by ancient volcanoes that attract people, and that, of course, sets them up for disasters when the long dormant volcano erupts. But you're right, those were part of nature too. I mean, look at the beautiful lush vegetation on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, and that's all a result both of the climate as well as the rich soil from historic volcanic action.
And you still have an active volcano there.
Yes, indeed.
Too.
They're also making use of it too. There's a positive thing not so much with the volcanic eruptions though, but I read where they like 25% of their electrical power is provided with geothermal energy. They heat from below the ground to produce steam to drive their turbines, to run their generators and whatnot. And they also use the lower temperature water as heating other heating sources and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can't give you numbers, but I believe Iceland also uses a lot of
geothermal
big time, power.
Yes.
And there's a relative, talking in terms of long-term scale of volcanic activity, there's a relatively recent volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783, which they list that as the deadliest volcanic eruption in the time frame that they can make estimates of casualties. 5 million people, they estimate, died from that. And of course, that's much more than the population of Iceland was. In fact, they say on Iceland there were a little over 9,000 people that perished, which was about 25% of the island's population at that time. But this volcano was so powerful that it caused a disruption of weather patterns and agricultural production, and so about a million people in France, the rest of Northern Europe, and Egypt, they say, died as a result of the fallout, so to speak, from that volcano.
Yeah, the weather,
from
the change
crop
in the weather.
failures.
Crop failures and whatnot.
Yeah.
Um,
And they say that it altered the global temperature in that was in 1783, and in the winter of 1784, the Mississippi froze over in New Orleans, attributed to the climate change that resulted from that volcano.
That'd be worth looking into.
And ice crystals formed in the Gulf of Mexico off the Louisiana coast.
Probably killed a lot of sea life, too, because that's a relatively quick change in things, I would suspect.
Yeah.
But I don't know for sure. That's something else I need to learn about in the future, I guess.
So there's still potential for volcanic activity to cause a tremendous amount of death and destruction. If something that recent, we don't know when.
It happens. Well, there was just a few.
Yellowstone might blow.
Right. Well, about a decade ago or so, there was an eruption, I think, in Iceland, but the dust that came out shut down airports all across Europe.
Right. Yep.
Because of that, and so that was a significant event,
Right.
natural disaster. But
Yep.
I did want to talk about one other catastrophe and its positive effects, and that's forest fires. I mean, we were taught as kids. I was taught as a kid that you want to prevent forest fires. Smokey Bear says, that kind of thing. But and back then in the '60s, the National Forestry Service was trying to prevent fires, thinking they were a bad thing. But they since learned that actually made future forest fires that couldn't be prevented a lot worse.
Right.
How was that?
Well, what they say is that when they suppress the fires, then there's a lot more of the undergrowth that is fuel for future fires, and so when a future fire comes along, it can burn a lot hotter and be more difficult to control, and so it's kind of like trying to hold back a dam, and you can hold it back for so long, but eventually the pressure behind it's going to build up so great that you're no longer able to stop it. And
right.
So
or the pressure.
The forest fires that occur in areas where the fires have been suppressed so long are much more destructive and cause actual, in terms of what a forest fire is beneficial for, they burn so hot that they don't provide those benefits.
No, it destroys more than it helps. And also, from what I've read, your naturally occurring forest fires that haven't been made worse by man-made action, by man actions, provide for healthier forests by getting rid of that undergrowth, reducing the competition for nutrients, and allowing the trees that already exist to do better at what they do. But by the same token, there are also trees that depend upon fire for their survival. I think everybody's heard finally about the pine trees or other. I forget the classification of what pine is, but anyway, coniferous. There you go. They have cones. But some of those trees' cones require the high temperatures of fire to open up and release their seeds. And so the fires are necessary to keep that species going and like that. So, fires are good, and what they've done is just learn to control them where they have to, I guess is what they say. They let the fires start, but they only prevent them or suppress them when they're near people.
Yeah, some fires are good and some fires aren't so good.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if it weren't for people, wouldn't they all be good?
Well, would there be a good and bad?
Good point. It would just be. Yeah, good point. Yeah, I mean, okay, well, you threw me with that one. We're not supposed to think on here. Anyway.
Yeah, it's called a pause for reaction.
Yeah. Yes, pause for response, anyway, yeah. One little quickie here, since we're getting close to the end of the show. I want to talk a little bit about the Coriolis effect.
Okay.
And that is what causes hurricanes and other bodies of water to swirl in one direction or the other. And as briefly as I can and concisely as I can, the way I understand it is with hurricanes, all wind flows in a direct line from high pressure to low pressure. Why we get this spinning effect, though, is because the Earth is rotating and the low pressure is staying the same relative to the Earth, I think it is, or vice versa. I'm already getting off track. But the low pressure is moving,
Yeah.
and so the winds that are going toward it end up having to curve around to get back to it, or to get to it, to keep going in toward it. I guess it appears to the people on the ground that these winds are going in a circular motion, but in fact they are winds and they are causing a lot of damage. But of course, everybody knows that hurricanes in the northern hemisphere rotate counterclockwise, and in the southern hemisphere they rotate clockwise. And I did want to point out that one of the things I did learn, we always learn something new, at least I do anyway, when we get ready for these shows, is that there's an old myth, and it is a myth, that when you flush your toilet in the northern hemisphere, it goes in one direction, and in the southern hemisphere, it goes in the other. And that's wrong. That's incorrect. It has nothing to do with the Coriolis effect. It has more to do with irregularities in the surfaces of the toilet bowls or your sink or whatever. But and you can look that up. I'm right. Anyhow, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We've got to go. I've already run over time again. But you have a good evening. Have a good night.